These were not people I cared about. Once I tied them up and started roughing them up, they became toys to me. Catching a serial killer is never an easy task. These criminals are usually low-profile individuals, able to blend in seamlessly with society. Their great facility to go unnoticed means that they barely interact with others, so they hardly draw attention to themselves. They're also very meticulous in their actions, fully aware that their actions can have serious consequences. Therefore, trying to understand them is very complex, as they do not simply like to kill. Many times, they do not seek that end. Rather, death is only a collateral result of their horrific actions. Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, United States. Robert Berdella was born in 1949 under the harsh abuse of his father. Robert was a lonely child. He wore glasses from the age of 5 because of early myopia. In addition, he had speech difficulties and high blood pressure, which forced him to take daily medication. At school, he stood out for his grades and for his great love of cooking and art. But if there was a turning point in Robert's life, it was his adolescence. Having been raised Catholic and having attended church regularly, Robert had strongly repressed his homosexuality. So when he reached puberty, he discovered that he did indeed like boys, a fact that made him feel different from the rest of his peers. Because of this fear, Robert decided to withdraw into himself and leave his religion. He even started dating a girl to avoid possible rumors about his orientation. Along with the discovery of his love tastes, Robert was also forever marked by the film The Collector, directed by William Wyler in 1965. A film in which a young butterfly collector kidnaps an art student and locks her in a basement in order to make her fall in love with him. At the age of 18, Robert began studying art at the Kansas City Art Institute. But instead of attending class, he began using drugs and alcohol and selling narcotics. As a result of this possession and sale of substances, Robert was arrested, although he was never convicted. After that incident, Robert dropped out of school, began working as a cook in a restaurant, and bought 4315 Charlotte Street, the sinister house of horrors where Robert would perpetrate future murders. Over the years, Robert came out of the closet and became a respected member of his community, joining the neighborhood patrol. In addition, his reputation as a chef further enhanced his social reputation. However, everything changed when in 1981, he decided to turn his life around. Robert hung up his apron and opened a business selling antiques and rare objects. The so-called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. Overnight, Robert began selling fake skulls, earrings with human teeth, lava lamps, incense, and a multitude of esoteric paraphernalia. But despite this sudden turn in his life, no one suspected him or his more than strange trade. His neighbors continued to see Robert as a formal and harmless man. However, when Robert suffered a romantic breakup with a war veteran he was dating, his whole world collapsed. Thus, Robert put aside his dignity and started dating very young gigolos, to whom he offered his house in exchange for sharing expenses. A way of life that would soon unleash Robert's ruthless violence. On July 4th, 1984, Robert finally fulfilled his dream of emulating his favorite movie, The Collector. Robert picked up Jerry Howell, a young lover of his who owed him money, to take him home. Once inside, he drugged him, and as soon as he lost consciousness, he tied him up in a basement room, and began to defile him with various objects. The next morning, Robert went quietly to work. When he returned, he continued the abuse and humiliation of Jerry. Hours later, he hung him by his feet, dismembered him, and wrapped his remains in several packages, which he later threw in the trash. With this first murder, Robert would begin a kind of terror diary. In it, he would document all the tortures of his victims, as well as their reactions. In addition, to complete each story, he would attach various photographs to show the suffering caused. Thus, Robert had just inaugurated his diary with Jerry's death. But he still had a lot of work to do to complete his macabre notebook. His next victim would be Robert Sheldon, a former tenant of his. When he arrived at his door, he asked him if he could stay at his house again for a short period of time. But even though Sheldon was responsible when it came to paying the rent, Robert considered him an inconvenience. So, he decided to take action. Since he was not physically attracted to Sheldon, Robert opted to drug him with sedatives and hold him captive in the bedroom for 3 days. He saw him as an individual upon whom to express his anger and personal frustration. Poor innocent Sheldon had to endure serious torture, such as rubbing his eyes with drain cleaner, tying his wrists with piano wire to permanently damage the nerves in his hands, inserting needles under his fingertips, filling his ears with putty to reduce his hearing. But on the 3rd day, Robert's plans got complicated. He didn't remember that a workman had arranged to fix the roof of his house. So in order not to be discovered, Robert was forced to end Sheldon's life. He placed a sack over his head. He tightened it with a piece of string. And to finish off his despicable work of art, he carried Sheldon's body upstairs to the 3rd floor bathroom, dissected it, buried it in the yard, and kept his head in the freezer. In June 1985, Robert murdered Mark Wallace just 2 months after Sheldon's death. This time, Robert increased his brutality even more and added electric shocks to the other tortures. In September of that same year, Robert took the life of James Ferris. And in June 1986, he killed Todd Stoops, who had previously alerted the police to his suspicious disappearances. In Todd's case, Robert unleashed all his malice and ferocity. He sodomized him with his fist and ruptured his anal cavity, which caused him to go into septic shock, resulting in his subsequent death a month later. The last victim to die at Robert's hands was Larry Pearson, a 20-year-old prostitute whom he subjected in July 1987 to the same kind of torture. After spending 6 weeks enslaving him, Robert severely beat Larry to death as he tried to escape. And as with Sheldon, he decided to keep his head in the freezer. Robert's modus operandi was always the same. He befriended young sex workers, and after having intimate relations with them, he drugged them and tortured them savagely. His intention was to extend the pain as long as possible, to give him time to fulfill all his sadistic fantasies, and to record his achievements in his diary. But, as every story has an ending, Robert's would come after he had murdered 6 men. Chris Bryson, the only survivor, would manage to escape from captivity and report Robert's crimes. It all happened at the end of March 1988, when Chris woke up tied to a bed in Robert's basement, with a dog collar around his neck and a severe blow to his head. The abuse he was suffering was impossible to bear. It was too much torture. So Chris eventually lost consciousness. But 4 days later, he came to his senses and managed to free himself from the restraints, taking advantage of a moment when Robert was out. Chris found no other way to escape than jump out of the window and call for help. He was completely naked. He wore only the dog collar around his neck. Several neighbors rushed to Chris's aid, who, with a broken leg after the jump, detailed to police the horror he had suffered in Robert's basement. When officers arrived at the House of Horrors, they found a room full of torture devices, ropes, electrical cords, syringes, and a collection of more than 200 photographs of naked and tortured men. They also found the notebook with the macabre details of each victim, as well as the 2 heads in the freezer, and various remains buried in the garden. In the face of such evidence and the testimony of the sole survivor, Robert was charged with 6 murders, 7 counts of sodomy, and the kidnapping and attempted murder of Chris. Thus, Robert had no choice but to close the doors of his slaughterhouse. During the trial, held in December 1988, Robert made a plea bargain with the prosecution and pleaded guilty in exchange for a detailed confession to the murders. After 3 days of testimony and 700 pages with all the details of his crimes, Robert escaped death in the electric chair and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Robert never expressed remorse for his actions. He never apologized for the murders. He even described his victims as dummies. These were not people I cared about. Once I tied them up and started roughing them up, they became toys to me. Before going to prison for life, the Kansas Butcher, as he was dubbed by the press, set up a $50,000 fund for the families of the murdered. It was his way of compensating them for all the suffering he had caused them. Finally, on October 8, 1992, in the state prison in Jefferson City, and of a heart attack, Robert died. Although there were rumors that Robert had in fact been poisoned, they were never confirmed. With his death, the sinister antiquarian took to his grave the places where he had disposed of the rest of his victims. So unfortunately, their relatives were never able to bury them. Robert was one of the serial killers who shocked the world the most. A criminal obsessed with recreating the movie The Collector, and who enjoyed dissecting his victims as if they were butterflies. A truly cruel torture carried out in his House of Horrors. He was Robert Berdella, the Butcher of Kansas.